Let's open our Bibles, please, at Hosea and chapter 3. We're going to pick up precisely where we left off with our brother Pete. Hosea chapter 3. There's an interesting time period, brothers and sisters, young people, in our scriptures of truth, which the Bible calls the latter days. Fantastic study. If you ever just pick up a concordance, just follow that through. We're going to look at some of those references this afternoon. The latter days. Hosea chapter 3. We're going to dive right in. We're talking about a time period where the children of Israel, verse 4, shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return, and seek Yahweh their God, and David their king, and shall fear Yahweh and his goodness in the latter days. Okay, so Hosea is prophesying. He's saying, listen, there's going to be this time period. You're not going to have a king. You're not going to have any of this pagan worship that you've got going on. You're not going to have sacrifices. There's going to be this period. But then you are going to return, and it's when you finally return, that's when you're going to seek Yahweh, your God, in the latter days. Okay? In the latter days. So what Brother Thomas says about that. He says, here is a long period indicated, termed many days. That's where it is there in verse 4, abide many days, during which the Israelites were to be without king, prince, or sacrifice. It is evident that that period is not yet ended because they are still without those elements of their polity. When did he say that? 1868. There was no Israel. The Jews were scattered all over the place. And this period, when they would be without these things, he says, is still here. But at some point in the future, they're going to be regathered to their land. They're going to return, and they'll ultimately be converted in a process of time by which they will be seeking Yahweh, their God. And what have we seen, brothers and sisters? We have seen them return. Brother Pete's gone through some of this. We have seen the Jews return. 1968, they went back to their land, declared their independence. 1967, Jerusalem is taken into Jewish control once again. And it's quite easy, isn't it, my dear brothers and sisters, and perhaps for the young people, we kind of get complacent, don't we? Like, yeah, of course Israel's there. Like for 2,000 years, they were all over the place, and they've been regathered. This is not the time to get complacent. Yes, they've been there. We're witnessing the 70 years of them being in the land. Now's the time not to get complacent. How much longer will it be? We've been given the indication that in the latter days, they will return. They have returned. We've started the time period of the latter days. We're in it right now. And ultimately, the culmination of that latter days will be that Israel, the hope of Israel, that the nation of Israel will turn again to Yahweh. So let's go over to Daniel. We've already been in Daniel, but I want to show you something quite interesting. We're going to go to Daniel chapter 10 this time. And, Daniel, what an amazing prophet and man Daniel actually was. We find him in Daniel chapter 10, and he's in mourning. He wants to know more about the prophetic word. There'll be more men like Daniel, my dear brothers and sisters, in this world that we live in. He's in mourning. You read there in verse 2, for 3 full weeks. And so God, in his mercy, sends him an angel. And this is what the angel says in verse 14 to Daniel. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days. We've got those connections there, many days, latter days, right? Same story, Hosea chapter 3. The angel's going to reveal a few more details to Daniel at this time. And when we get on to Daniel 11, so that the angel starts talking through all these events that are going to take place, we're going to find that there's a great crescendo where the angel leads Daniel in his thinking, and he's going to tell him what's going to happen to his people, Israel, in the latter days. Daniel chapter 11 is all about these territories, the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire. The 4 generals of Alexander, when Alexander dies, pick up these 4, and the record picks up on 2 of them. The territory of Seleucus, the king of the north, and the territory of Ptolemy, king of the south. And so as you go through Daniel chapter 11, you get this kind of warring between the king of the south and king of the north, down through time. All these signs of the times for the faithful believers as they go through history. And when you get, it's interesting, I would suggest, if you're a young person, a great study is to kind of colour in every time it says king of the north, one colour. Every time it says king of the south, another colour, because it really helps to kind of get you where you are. But when you come to verse 36, you will notice, if you do that exercise, it's kind of like the king of the north and the king of the south. They almost disappear, because we've reached the time in history when the Roman power takes over the territory of the king of the north and the king of the south. And the Roman power occupies Constantinople. We're talking about the Byzantine Empire here. And so by that point, both are covered in this king. But interestingly, in verse 40, we find out that at the time of the end, there's going to be a revival. There's going to be a revival, yes, of the king of the south. We're not going to focus on that in our talk for today. But there is going to be a revival of the king of the north. That territory is going to be controlled once again. And we read that the king of the north, midway through verse 40, shall come against him. That's the power in Constantinople. The Turkish power today. Like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land. What's that? That's the land of Israel. So we have this invasion now into the land of Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown, and these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Notice some of these details, verse 43. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. The Hebrew there implies they're marching with him. They're kind of confederate with him, this king of the north. But tidings out of the east and of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. That's the ultimate end of this king of the north power. This is what's going to happen in the latter days. At the time of the end, we read there, verse 40. This is what the angel's leading up to when he talks to Daniel. None is going to help him. The Ethiopians and the Libyans will be with him. This invading force from the north into Israel in the latter days will ultimately be destroyed. So, with that kind of preamble, and we're going quick. Like me and Pete, we don't muck around. Like we are, you're going to get it today, I'm just telling you. I'm sorry about that. We are going for it. Let's turn up Ezekiel chapter 38. This is where we're going to spend most of our time for the remainder of this study and the next study. We'll deviate here and there, but Ezekiel 38 is the most exciting, I would suggest, or one of the most exciting prophecies that we have available to us living now in the latter days. Why? Because Ezekiel 38, it tells us who's involved and who the nations are. We've already had Libya. We've already had Ethiopia. We get a few more. But before we dive into that, just think about this. Let's just check this is the same story. Look at this, verse 8. After many days, thou shalt be visited in the latter years. Hebrew, the latter days. So we're in the latter day period. We're in the same period as Hosea. We're in the same period as Daniel 10 and 11. And here we are in Ezekiel 38, same story. We know it's the same story because Israel are back in the land. It says, in the latter years, thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. So this mountains of Israel, today West Bank area, this invading force comes against those people on the mountains of Israel, which had been waste. They'd been waste for 2,000 years. But they've been restored. They've been regathered to them, the people of Israel. And we're told they're dwelling safely at the end of verse 8. Confidently. Verse 11, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely. All of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. In verse 12 we read, they come to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited. Emphasis again, they were desolate. They're now inhabited. And upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, they were scattered. This is a prophecy of the time when they are regathered, which have gotten cattle and goods and dwell in the midst of the land. This is our time, brothers and sisters. Israel is there on the mountains, in the land. This is exciting for us, isn't it? This is exciting. And what happens? Same story as Daniel 11. Verse 15, we read, this invading force comes out from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company and a mighty army. And they're this great confederacy, aren't they? Verses 1 through 9, we're going to take a look at that in detail in a minute. We get all of the detail of who these nations are. And then we find in verse 18, it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog, that's the leader of this army, shall come against the land of Israel, saith Adonai Yahweh, that my fury shall come up in my face. And so God acts. He saves Israel in that day. And the whole purpose of it in verse 23, thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. They don't know now. They're going to know then, brothers and sisters. They are going to know the God of Israel is once again active in the earth, open manifestation of his power. Just quickly, it's the same story in Ezekiel 39. Slightly different emphasis, but there is the same story. We read in verse 4 that this Gog will fall upon the mountains of Israel. Daniel 11 is going to come to his end when he plants his tabernacles in the glorious mountain. In verse 11 and on, we read about these great graves that are going to be set up for this mighty army that falls. And what is the great purpose of all these things? Well, if you look at verse 23, the heathen shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they trespassed against me. Therefore hid I my face from them, and gave them into the hand of their enemies. So fell they all by the sword, and so on. But we read in verse 25, therefore thus saith Adonai Yahweh, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob, and have mercy upon the whole house of Israel, and will be jealous for my holy name. In verse 28 we read, and then shall they know that I am Yahweh, their God. At the end of verse 22, so the house of Israel shall know that I am Yahweh, their God, from that day and forward. It's the same story as Hosea. It's at that time when Israel will turn again to God and will be known by them, and he'll be known by them. A couple of quick verses if you're taking notes. You can dovetail this, you see, into other prophecies. It's so beautiful. You know, we read in Zechariah 13 of the terrible invasion in the land and some of the terrible trials that Israel will have to go through. But at the end, I will say, says God, it is my people, and they shall say, Yahweh is my God. This is the hope of Israel. This is Israel turning again to God. This is the start of the kingdom of God on the earth. We know that, Micah 4. But in the last day, Hebrew, latter days, it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of Yahweh shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow unto it. And thou, O tower of the flock, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, unto thee shall it come, even the first dominion, the kingdom shall come to the daughter of Jerusalem. This is the nucleus of the kingdom of God. The people in the land right now, they live and breathe the same air as we do. They're the start of the kingdom coming to Israel. They're the beginning, and we're witnessing it. We are witnessing it, brothers and sisters. How can we not be interested in Israel? How can we not be interested in the things that are going on in the Holy Land? Because we have these wonderful prophecies from the Father, indicating to us in the latter days what's going to happen. How can we turn a blind eye to that? What's going to happen? Well, as we've mentioned, we are at this point where Israel has returned. They have not yet completely sought David their king and Yahweh their God. And so we're right on the brink of that happening, brothers and sisters. And we have these signs of the times. This is why it's wonderful we can all gather here together to remind ourselves of these things. What happens? Oh, I love that graphic. I love it. I had to do it. I'm sorry. A great cloud comes to cover the land. Okay? A great cloud. And it comes like a whirlwind, it says in Daniel 11. It's a violent, aggressive cloud from the north. And we read, as we've already indicated, of the specific nations that are with this terrible character Gog, which is mentioned in verse 2. Son of man, set thy face against Gog. These are the nations that are with Gog at that time. Now Ezekiel the prophet, he is speaking, and God has chosen Ezekiel around 600 BC, and he's chosen Ezekiel to reveal this prophecy to the people of Israel, who in Ezekiel's time were starting to, they were scattered in Babylon. And so ultimately, they're given to comfort Israel that eventually, there's all this stuff going to happen, but eventually the people will return to Yahweh and will know him. And God chose that mainly for the comfort of those people, but has left it on record for us. And so what we have to do is we have to go back as far as we can to try and understand who are these nations. So let's read them. They're there in verse 2. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech. Well, that should say the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. We'll come into that in a minute. And prophesy against him and say, thus saith Adonai Yahweh, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws. I'll bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Who's with him? Persia. And then look at this. Ethiopia and Libya. Daniel 11. And with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Verse 6, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared. Prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. So we've got these nations, written 600 BC. How do we find out what they mean? Well, unfortunately, we have to go back to history. Now, I say unfortunately because most of the time I find history pretty dry. Most of the time. But when we can connect it to the scriptures of truth, suddenly it gets really exciting. Let me show you some history. This is Josephus. Magog founded that from him were named Magogites, but who are, by the Greeks, called Scythians. So this is Josephus, 94 AD. This is like someone talking now about what happened, say, to Henry VIII in terms of our time, right? And he says that these Magogites, the Greeks called the Scythians. So we've got to figure out, well, where's Scythia? And we go to Herodotus, the father of history, one of the earliest historians we have access to. And he tells us that there's these 8 rivers that go through the land of Scythia in his time. And he's writing approximately 450 BC. So only a few hundred years off of Ezekiel, right? And there they are, these rivers. Now I'll show you where they are on a map. He says they stretch this land of Magog from the river Don to the river Danube. He says that's the land of Scythia. That's the land of Magog, says Josephus. So when we come to our Bible and we see this Gog, he's of the land of Magog, he's right there, in Eastern Europe and Western Russia. Some other experts, I've got tons of this. I'm not going to read through all of them because we'll be here all day. And I don't want to take after Brother Pete. He's been a bad example to me already. So these, I'll just pop them on the screen. But just have a look. For example, Smith's Bible Dictionary. We're not the only ones to conclude this. We may conclude that Magog represents the important race of the Scythians. Okay, so this isn't just Matt Davies or Brother Thomas or anyone like that just making it up. These are other outside sources who have also concluded these things. Now, as I mentioned, if you look at Young's literal or even some of the more modern translations, the Hebrew here demands that the word Rosh, Meshach and Tubal are kind of together and they're all names. So in the AV it says the chief prince of Meshach. The word for chief is Rosh, and really it should be prince of Rosh, Meshach and Tubal, as in Young's literal there on the screen. Now that is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating, because the Rus, or the Rosh, they are an important people that crop up in history. Now, it's a bit cloudy where they come from. Like, we can't deny that. They are clearly at play around 900 AD. They emerge as this great power, the Rus, the people of the rivers of Russia. We read of them coming to France, and they find some envoys come across, and we are called the Rus, they say, 839 AD. We find in the travels of this Muslim explorer, Ahmed ibn Faladin, that he meets them by the Volga. So he comes across these people of the Rus. But they're up there in the north, and it's a bit murky up there. There's not kind of history and libraries and stuff like that. There's not the preservation. But they emerge on the scene. And it's really interesting because in 860 AD, approximately, the Rus come and they attack Constantinople. And so here is a picture of them coming, a medieval Russian icon that's there in Zagreb, a detail of the Rus. They're the Rus. They're coming for Constantinople. This is interesting. This is the primary chronicle. And it says, approximately 860 AD, that it was at that time they become established, and they call their land the land of Rus. And when they burst upon the scene, I find this quote absolutely fascinating. This is a kind of a church monk called Leo the Deacon. Good old Leo. And Leo, he's there, and he sees this Rus people come up, and they're violent and they're aggressive. And he says about them that these people that came and attacked and they're violent is attested by many people, among them the holy Ezekiel, who alludes to them when he says as follows, "Behold, I will bring upon you Gog and Magog, the ruler of the Russi." So when these people pop up, there's Bible students looking at them saying, do you know what? These are the guys from Ezekiel 38. These are the Rus. This is the Rus people. This isn't just Matt Davies now saying this about them. There were people back then saying it. But as I say, it's a bit sketchy because before that there's lots of debates as to where originally the Rus came from. But I think it's quite interesting that in the Septuagint version of the scriptures, which was, it's a bit hazy exactly when it came about, but approximately we could say 200 BC, so not too far off of when Ezekiel kind of was written. It's interesting that the Greek scholars who were translating the Hebrew into Greek at that time, they come across this word Rus, and they kind of translate it as a name, and they translate it as this noun, the Rus. There it is on the screen. And I wonder, was it that the Greeks knew of a people called the Rus at their time that gave them confidence to translate this as the Rus? And interestingly, in Greek today, this word, this PW squiggle, that is kind of makes up the modern Greek name for Russia even today. Fascinating when you think about it. Some more experts. Gesenius says, Rosh, proper name of a northern nation, undoubtedly the Russians. There's others on the screen there. Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, the name Russia. Amazing. Now, there is, as I say, some debate as to where these Rus people come from. We know from 900 AD they're there, and they're in the area of Russia, and they become the modern nation of Russia today. But before that, there's some debate. Were they from Scandinavia, or were they Slavic in origin? It kind of turns out, it seems to me in my research, that they were kind of like a mixed race of people. But I find it fascinating that around the time of Ezekiel, they found these kind of stellas here. Does that work? There you go, sort of there. And there was this nation, this kind of kingdom or group of nations, I can't say it, Uratag, and they had some kings who undoubtedly have this Rus connection in them, okay, in the area of Russia. So I think the Rus, they're there, they're mixed up, but they come to the fore, and I think they would have been known to the people of Ezekiel's time, and they would have been aware that the Rus were there from the north, coming, and this prophecy is that they're going to come down, they're going to band together with all these others and come down. So I think we can say that the Rosh, they're there in that area, central Russia. That's being conservative. Maybe they were even further out into the whole territory by the river Volga. What about Meshech and Tubal? Okay, let's keep going. I want to do this all the way through. So, Meshech and Tubal, Herodotus says they're these people of the Moski and the Tibereri. They're mentioned in Assyrian records as the Moski. Strabo, who's a kind of a Greek geographer, he mentions that they are around the Caucasian Mountains, which is in southern Russia, kind of Georgia area. Josephus mentions that they're there, and so others have concluded that this is the area of the Caucasian Mountains. So when you kind of look at it on a map, we're looking at Caucasian Iberia there. That is the area of Meshech and Tubal, and of course it is likely that those people spread north, and it's possible that that's where the name for Moscow came from these people, the Meshech, the people of Meshech. So these really would be the peoples of southern Russia. What about Persia? Well, Persia's quite an easy one for us, right? Because we're all quite familiar with, Pete's already mentioned the Medes and the Persians, we're all quite familiar with that. It's only recently, I mean, this is Darius the Great, one of his inscriptions. These are all the nations that he ruled over around the time of Ezekiel, not far off. This is the area of the Empire of Persia. But interestingly, recently, in 1935, the Iranians said to everyone, please don't call us Persia anymore, call us Iran. And so we have it there. Unfortunately for them, though, they forgot to rename their sea, because the sea that's just under Iran is called the Persian Gulf. Right? They forgot. Whoops. So it's still known as the Persian Gulf. So, young people, we can't go wrong. Persia is this area of Iran. So Iran's with them. We've got the Russians there. We've got the Scythians, the kind of the core Europeans, the Eastern Europeans there. We've got all of these people coming together, and now we've got Persia added to the mix. What about Ethiopia and Libya? Again, not too difficult, but we can stretch back into time, and we can find Herodotus mention Libya. We can find Herodotus mention Ethiopia in the area of Africa, North Africa, as it almost is today. Again, Josephus, Africa. When we go to the experts, Ethiopia and Libya, an African nation. And so when we plot it on a map, we're kind of talking roughly in these areas, Libya, Ethiopia. What about Gomer? Well, Josephus says Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call Galatians, but were then called Gomerites. And in the context of that, he's talking about the Galatia near France, on the western side of Europe. Diodorus Silicius, another kind of historian, says, becoming renowned for his bravery, Galates called his subjects Galatia, or Gauls, after himself. And these in turn gave their name to all of Galatia, or Gaul. Young people, you ever read Asterix the Gaul? Big fan of Asterix. My son Moses loves Asterix the Gaul. Asterix the Gaul is in the area of France. And this is the area we're talking about here, of Gomer. Gomer. And we've got tons of references up there about that as well. The north and west of Europe, says Easton's Bible Dictionary. So we can pop it in there. There's Gomer. So we've got all these nations coming together to invade Israel in the latter days. Last one, Togarmah. Josephus says these were called the Phrygians by the Greeks. Herodotus says that the Phrygians were called the Armenians. And so we have this connection to the Armenians. A lot of commentaries connect with the people of Armenia, this people of Togarmah. Bullinger, for example, Togarmah equals Armenia. Now, what's interesting about the peoples of Armenia is they're closely connected to the peoples of Turkey. They are very, very closely connected. There's this historical connection with parts of eastern Turkey, the homeland. And what's fascinating in the Bible, have you ever seen this? In verse 6, because we're talking about all these nations, and in verse 6 it says, and Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah. Now you've got to ask the question, why is it saying the house of Togarmah? Well, we looked in Daniel 11 and we saw that the king of the north power comes against him, the Turkish power in Constantinople, and overflows from there and carries on down. So it's interesting that this isn't saying Togarmah's there. This is saying the house of Togarmah's there. I'm just going to suggest that we're talking about the Turkic nations, the house of Togarmah, which came out of Turkey. These are the Turkic nations. All of them is the house of Togarmah. Turkey itself is taken over by that Russian power, as we know. Just a suggestion. And so we have there the house of Togarmah. The Turkic peoples, they join in as well. So where does that leave us? Not much. Someone said not much. There it all is. Okay? The Gogian Confederacy. And they all come down from the north upon Israel. Now, verse 17 says this in Ezekiel 38, Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, Art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants, the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? So we've already seen that God, this isn't an isolated prophecy. We're encouraged by the Spirit to connect this prophecy with other prophecies, with the other prophecies of the prophets of Israel. We've already done it in Hosea. We've already done it in Daniel 11. But where else might we pick up on this idea that there's going to be this unification of the kingdoms of men that Pete's talked about, that the Lord Jesus Christ is going to come about when he returns? Classic Christadelphian lecture, Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, we often go through the timeline, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the legs of iron, the feet of iron and clay. What is that all about? There is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in when? In the latter days. Same time period, brothers and sisters. The same time period as Ezekiel 38, the same time period as Daniel 11, the same time period as Hosea 3. This is what's going to happen in the latter days. And when we get to the end of the story, we often think about it in a continual historic timeline. And absolutely, that is absolutely correct and right that we should do so. But it's fascinating, don't you think, some of the details that we're given. Because when the stone power comes and crushes the kingdoms of men power, it says, Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together. It's all ground up together, you know? And Pete's already mentioned that the thinking of Babylon in the head, it goes down through these different powers, but also the territories, I'd suggest. The territories, if you link them all together, come to this area here, and we find that they also connect together with Ezekiel 38. So when the stone power comes down, it is going to be against these peoples. I think this is what it's telling us about. It's telling us that these peoples will be united when the stone power comes. They're all broken in pieces together. Pete's already mentioned this. You know, we can't get enough of this, me and Pete. We're going to quote it again, because the force of this now, once we've gone through that, is profound. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things at present constituted is at hand. Brothers and sisters, where are we? We're in the latter days. The Jews have returned. What do we see when we look up from our Bibles into our news, into the world around us? We see the growing power of Russia. The Rosh. They're on the move. Think about this. What have we seen recently? We've seen them annex Crimea. Like they don't care. No one can do anything. And they're smart. They're sneaky. They turn up in uniforms that no one really understands what's going on. Before they understand what's going on, done. They're there. They've got Crimea back. We see them move from Russia into the Ukraine. Only a few years ago. Do you remember this? They're still there. They're still there in Ukraine. They want the Volga back. They want to get back their homeland. And what else? We've seen them, as we've already spoken of with Pete, come down into Syria. Russia is on the move. It is starting to build its empire up. Only a few years ago that started. And again, like Pete said, like we can become complacent. Like, yeah, of course Russia's there. What? 2,000 years. The Jews have been scattered. They're back. You know, since Brother Thomas's time, we've been looking for Russia to rise up, to come down. They're down. They're right there. This is what we're looking at. Putin is preparing for World War III. Yeah, that's bad news. It's bad news. For the world, it's bad news. But for us that know the scriptures, it's a great sign of the times. The Lord is about to return. We're going to be with him to save Israel in that day. Earlier this year, Putin gets up in front of all his important people in his I think it's like his state of the country kind of address. And he says, you listen to us now, he says to the world. You're going to listen to us. And then he goes on to unveil his new toys. He goes on to unveil his weapons. And some of them are insane. Like he's got these weapons that go faster than sound and can deliver a nuclear bomb anywhere in the US and nothing can stop it. Nothing can stop it at all. He's talking about nuclear-powered cruise missiles with unlimited range, nuclear-armoured hypersonic boost glide vehicles. He's talking about some new intercontinental ballistic missiles called the Satan II. Yeah. He talks about a nuclear-armed underwater drone, hypersonic cruise missiles. Hypersonic cruise missiles. You can't even hear them. Boom, you're gone. A laser-pointed defense-directed energy weapon. This is what Putin's doing in his spare time. He's thinking about this stuff. While others are playing golf on the golf course, this is what Putin's looking at. Look at what he does here. This is only last month. Putin launches this. World War III threat. Chilling footage shows Putin's submarines carry out mock atomic strike. He is preparing. The King of the North is on the march. Aggressors will be annihilated, says Putin. Don't stand in our way. But he also says, interestingly, we'll go to heaven as martyrs. You can't kill us. There's a religious angle to this. There's a religious angle. It's frightening, isn't it? In September, he plays some games. Here they are. Russia launches biggest war game since Cold War with more than 300,000 troops. They're doing drills, bigger than they've ever done since the fall of the Soviet Union. The rise of the Rosh. They call it Vostok 2018 military exercises. We're told they're horrifying and awe-inspiring. Who else is doing stuff like this? Is America? Is Britain? Are Europe? Not to this scale, brothers and sisters, not to this scale. Russia's growing threat to North Europe. You know, the European countries are terrified. They're dropping leaflets to their citizens saying what to do if Russia attacks. This is the world we're living in. And this pressure from Russia upon Europe is interesting. You know, Brother Thomas, he says that Europe will be in chains to Russia. And we're seeing the power of Russia grow to the point where Europe, I would suggest, is going to have no chance at all if Russia was to attack. And so they will need to listen to Mr. Putin. Russia will control them. So this is them building up in the Baltic regions in Eastern Europe. Russia says to NATO, you should be wise and avoid war. Come listen to us. Come over to our side. That's the only problem, is that, you see, you've got the US there, and the US is kind of propping up these NATO nations in Central Europe. All it needs to take as Donald Trump, it's not a brother, he's not a brother, as Donald Trump has said, you know, he's less inclined to worry about NATO because the NATO nations aren't helping America. America's donating, America's losing strength. And so we find Russia kind of swanning around, don't we? Look at this. Russia will target European countries if they host US nuclear missiles, Mr. Putin. You want to side with Trump, this strange floppy-haired fellow, or do you want to come with me? That's what he's saying. And it's starting to work. Europe looks towards Russia in response to US foreign policy. Pete showed the picture of they're all holding hands together. Holding hands together. They're not holding hands with Trump. Trump's giving them the cold shoulder. Italy have started. Italy's gone over. Italy threatens to veto EU sanctions against Russia. You see, we are on this situation where it looks like Russia's kind of losing ground, but I would suggest we're only a heartbeat away from these nations forming exactly as the prophet Ezekiel says. Where are they in Africa? He's there. Russia, in Ethiopia, preparing agreements, doing deals, military cooperation. They're putting bases in here in Libya, the Russians. The Daily Mail think that they're there to help influence flooding Europe with all these refugees. Off you go, cause havoc in Europe. Putin's there. He's there in Libya. Russia setting its sights on lawless Libya, building up its military presence in Libya. It's amazing, brothers and sisters. Wherever we go, Iran, Persia, close ties with Russia. And now we're finding Russia saying to Germany, saying to France, come on, come with us, help us sort out Syria. They're buddies, they're all in it together. They're building up their air bases in Syria. They're in the Middle East, the King of the North territory, as Brother Pete has said. There, you can see the standoff. We've got the Russians in the south of Syria and the US in the north. 4 new air bases in Syria. Another 6,000 troops. We're told here that Russia is establishing permanent presence at its Syrian base. Permanent. They're not going home. They're there. And of course we had this incident. I don't know if anyone saw this, right? So Israel, they're very worried about Iran. So they send some planes over to sort out, in Syrian territory, some Iranian stuff that's going on. And they shoot down a convoy. And the Syrians, they're not very good at aiming. And unfortunately, instead of killing an Israeli plane or shooting down an Israeli plane, they accidentally shoot down a Russian plane, their ally. Now, that was the Syrians' fault, it seems. However, Israel's like, oh no, maybe Russia's going to blame us. And so there's this kind of apologetic Israel talking to Russia, even though it was the Syrians that shot down the plane. However, interestingly, Russia now, not happy with Israel, they're saying, what are you doing on the Golan Heights anyway, you Israelis? They challenged Israel's sovereignty to the Golan Heights. That is last month. What about this? Straight away, Putin says, we're not having that again. Here, Mr. Syrians, have some equipment. Have these state-of-the-art S-300 missile systems to stop this happening. This he gives it to Assad, who's been bombing his people, right? Here you go, have some state-of-the-art, free of charge, and they give them these anti-aircraft missiles. World War III, Russia vows to protect Syria with missiles as Assad aims to increase allies. It's heating up, brothers and sisters. And Israel is right there at the heart of it all. Russia's latest move in Syria reveal it as an enemy to Israel. This is where we're getting to. Look at this. Russia to deploy military police on the Golan Heights. We have the boots of the Rus walking over the northern part of Israel, my dear brothers and sisters. They're right there. This is Israel on the left here, and this is the Golan Heights here, and they're there. They're patrolling it. They're right there. We've got them coming right down to the borders. Look what it says. Russia exerts growing clout in Middle East as it begins patrols in the Golan Heights. Wow. Israel will have to think twice about the next strike because Russia, the threat of Russia, is right at its doorstep. What do we read in Zechariah? Behold, the day of Yahweh cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. It is going to happen. We're seeing it begin. We could be taken, though, brothers and sisters, at any moment, because in Zechariah 14, we read that when this invading force comes down, that God acts, and this is what we read. We read about Christ and the saints being with Christ at that time. Then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, and Yahweh my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. So the saints are with Christ when they come to save Israel. That means the resurrection and judgment has taken place before this event. Because the saints can't be with Christ unless they've already been gathered to him. Isn't that exciting? So we may not see anymore. We could be taken at any moment, and the rest of the world events can continue on as the prophets have said, and we could be with Christ, preparing to save Israel in that day. This is what Brother Thomas says. He says, we have not to wait the advance of the Russian Gog against Constantinople, Daniel 11, and his overflowing and passing over and stretching forth his power over Egypt and the Holy Land. This will certainly come to pass, but it will be all consequent upon, not antecedent to, the appearing of Christ. In other words, brothers and sisters, Christ could come before. That's what we've been looking for. How much more have we got to see? How much more? He could come any minute. So, brothers and sisters, young people, friends, think about these things. Okay? These things are connected to the hope of Israel. These things are connected to the establishment of the kingdom on the earth. These things are connected to the gospel truth that God has used to call us all to be his sons and daughters with. So let's pay attention as we continue on. Let's focus our minds on Israel. Let us think about how God is at work in the nations. Let's be encouraged, and let's hold firm to the things that we have believed as a community until our Lord returns.